Hello, everyone. Hopefully, you're all having a good day here. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure we got all connected for everything so that we're not streaming somewhere. Well, so that we're streaming everywhere I want to be streaming, let's put it this way. So, I hope y'all are having a good day, and I'll make sure we are up here on YouTube for those that maybe want to comment later on YouTube or make sure we just streaming there as well, since YouTube has been giving me some problems recently with streams and whatnot. But it looks like we are up on YouTube, so I'll go ahead and pull this up real quick just to make sure. The video is loading. So today's topics is a rather interesting topic, and hopefully everyone will like the topic and find it interesting. And that is over criminal justice reform. A couple days ago, I believe it was on a Wednesday, I did a stream over police reform and the concept of trying to change the police, or the idea, or make police more friendly, or whatever word you want to necessarily use. And basically, we came to several solutions, possibly one of being community policing, that seem to have some good results in counties and areas across the United States. But there's a lot of debate on how effective community policing really is. So it's hard to necessarily tell exactly how much community policing or that type of idea would improve police reform and improve the respect and trust people have to police. Because as of right now, many people simply don't really trust the police or respect the police by any means. And the police are kind of seen as a bad force rather than a protective force, or maybe even a good force. But we're not talking about that on today's stream, but I just wanted to bring up that I am going to be making a recap video of the stream that I'm going to post on my YouTube channel. So if you don't want to watch that whole 2 hour and something minute long stream on police reform, you could watch the 10-minute or less video where I kind of summarize what we all learned for that. And I'm also going to have a summary video of today's stream as well. And I also am streaming on Trovo now, so my Trovo account is The Breakdown with WB, so you can check me out on Trovo as well, because I want to make sure I am going as many places as possible, so that people can find my content and everything like that. Even though I don't think you're technically allowed to on Twitch, but I don't know. I'm just having fun, so I don't really necessarily plan to do this as a career by any means yet. But if it does get that way, if I get big enough, I would love to do this as a career, because I love looking and learning with everybody kind of live on stream. So anybody that's kind of new to my content, basically on these type of streams, I just go and pick a topic, and I find scientific journals and articles and videos about the topic, and I just kind of read them and give my initial thoughts and kind of just basically research live on air. But I try to make it at least fun, because those of you who are in school or just graduated from school or whatever it might be don't necessarily want to be watching research streams or looking at research, because it can be very boring, and ultimately I don't think a lot of people necessarily find research as being very fun. But I do, that's kind of the type of streams I like to do. I like to learn kind of live on air, read your comments, think about everything with you guys, and just kind of go from there. So, as I was saying, this topic's on criminal justice reform, and the whole idea about criminal justice reform is the incarceration rate, or the amount of people that are in the United States prison system. And that prison system has a ton of nonviolent drug offenders and many other types of people. And a lot of people in politics recently, including Bernie Sanders, in the most recent political debate stage cycle, or president debate stage cycle, or whatever you want to say, but I think you get what I'm saying. was bringing up his justice reform plan because he found that there was a lot of just really bad things happening in the United States justice system. And many people have said that the United States justice system is by far the worst justice system in the world today, or at least of first world countries. I don't think that that's necessarily the case for, say, somebody who's in a third world country, or maybe a U.S. soldier that gets caught or something like that and goes to a prison, or and gets tortured there. But out of a first world nation and what they do to their own civilians, many people claim that the United States is the worst out of all of the first world nations. And we're going to get to some articles and talking about that. But I thought before we get into the nitty-gritty details of everything, I thought we kind of first needed to start with a general overview of prisons and jails and kind of what the differences are between them. Because ultimately we are bouncing around between the prison system compared to a county jail or something like that. And ultimately, when you hear about incarceration rates and mass crime or long-term sentences for non-violent drug offenders, you're talking about federal crimes and federal offenses, so they would be going to federal prisons. So that is kind of one distinction that we're going to be learning about, because a lot of people want to change politics-wise, want to change how prisons are designed and run, and ultimately they're talking about state prisons or federal prisons. But there are differences between the two and everything, so I just thought we would start first there and quickly go over the different types of prison types and just kind of what they are. So juvie is when an individual under the age of 18 is considered juvenile. Anyone who is not of legal age is never locked up in general prison with adults. And then you have your minimum, medium, and high security prisons. So obviously your minimum security prison is going to be the least security type, and your high security prison is obviously going to be your biggest security type. And there are differences between the two. And we're going to be watching a video later on with a guy named Larry Lawton, and he talks a lot about in his videos the types of security in prisons, and basically saying even a minimum security prison is going to have a pretty decent amount of security compared to other systems, because it's still a prison after all. So just because it's the minimum security and the least amount of security doesn't necessarily mean that you're just free to do anything. And there is a type of prison that you can be free to do anything from within, or free to do anything from within a spectrum. Like, you're never necessarily free if you're in jail or prison, but there's called camps, and they allow you to kind of be a little bit more free on your approach, or free on what you can do. Such as some camps have areas where the inmates can run on a track, or play basketball, or do some activity like that. Not all prisons have that, but there are some, and those are kind of called camps. And I don't know if they're going to be talking about camps on this article, but I thought I would kind of quickly mention that as well. But we'll read what they say about minimum security prisons. Minimum security prisons are usually reserved for white-collar criminals who have committed acts such as embezzlement or fraud. Although these are serious crimes, they are non-violent in nature, and therefore are predators and are not considered to be a risk for violence. These predators are sent to facilities that offer a dormitory type of living environment, fewer guards, and more personal freedoms. Then you have your minimum security, and that is minimum security prisons are the standard facilities used to house most criminals. They feature cage-style housing, armed guards, and much more regimented daily routine than minimum security prisons. And by the way, a medium security prison is usually going to have at least a minimum of one fence, but usually two fences with barbed wires on the top to reduce the chance of escape, or someone breaking into the prison for an escape, or whatever reason there might be. but I thought I would quickly mention that as well. Then you have your high security prisons, and those are reserved for most violent and dangerous offenders. These prisons include far more guards than both minimum and medium security, and have very little freedom. Each prison confined to such a is considered to be a high-risk individual, and people who go to these high-risk prisons are people that are serving life sentences, are very long-term sentences, or have a history of violence or multiple offenses. So if you have a history of a violent crime or a bad temper, or they believe that you could be someone who would start something in prison like a fight, you would be going to high security prisons. But most of the people who are in these high security prisons, at least federally, are people that are serving lifelong sentences, and in some states, serving lifelong sentences. Then you have your psychiatric. Lawbreakers who are deemed to be mentally unfit are sent to prisons that are designed for, which resemble hospitals. Once there, the inmates or patients receive psychiatric help for their mental disorders. As with any person that pursues methods of rehabilitation, psychiatric prisons are intended to try and help as opposed to just confining them as means of punishment. Then you have your military-style prisons, and we'll read it, but we're not ultimately talking about a military-style prison when we're talking about general reform, like we're about to get into. But I'll still read it because it is a type of prison, just for kind of general knowledge. Every branch of military has its own facilities that are used specifically for military personnel who have broken laws that affect national security or to house prisoners of war. The treatment of those prisoners has been subject of much debate in recent times, and the definition of torture for enemy combatants has become a controversial and often discussed topic. So that's why I was just mentioning previously that a lot of experts within prison reform are inmates that were previously ex-cons. In other words, they have gotten out of prison, but they're now talking about their prison life through either justice reform podcast, justice reform websites, or having their own channels, such as Larry Lawton, who I mentioned previously. They're talking about how they think that the way the U.S. prison works is so inhumane to its people that it's some of the worst prisons are in the United States in first-world countries. So if we really need to improve the style of a prison, because most of these people, even who were felons and said that they did do stuff wrong and that's why they were in prison, believe that they don't necessarily think that prison needs to be as bad as it is right now, especially when you're talking about private prisons. But that's a whole nother debate, and we are going to be talking about Biden's executive order that he signed with private prisons and some general thoughts and ideas in particular of private prisons, because this website doesn't necessarily talk about private prisons or private jails, but those do exist. But we'll read now against federal versus state. Federal prisons are under the jurisdiction of Federal Bureau of Prisons, or BOP, a subsidiary of the Department of Justice. If the crime the prisoner committed is federal, they would likely end up in a federal prison. The expectation is violent crimes, which are usually dealt with by state prisons. The federal prison system was started with the Three Prisons Act of 1891. The law created the first three federal prisons at Leavenworth, Kansas, Atlanta, and Georgia, and McNeil Island, Washington. State prisons are more numerous than federal prisons, as incarceration becomes the standard form of punishment in the United States. States begin creating their own similar but unique prison systems. Each state determines how its congressional system will function. The main difference besides offense between state and federal prison is the amount of time served in a sentence. Federal prisons prohibit parole, so the amount of time served is significantly higher than the average time served in a state prison. And we'll read one other thing that's talking about jails versus prisons in general, because I do think there's a lot of confusion from the general population about really what the difference between the two are. Jails is a locally operated short-term facility, where a prison is a state or federal operated long-term facility. Jails are mainly used for detaining inmates awaiting trial or sentencing. They can also house inmates who have been sustained for less than a year. This will vary depending on the state. Prisons are long-term facilities used after sentencing, while felons and inmates are housed for more than a year. These sentencing guidelines may vary by state. In 6 states, there is an intrigued correction system of jails and prisons. So now we just know a little bit about general information from juvie, minimum security, medium security, and high security, kind of what the differences are. It's not ultimately super important, but I thought I would first start there to kind of clear up any potential confusion as to what we mean by prison reform, because some of these efforts are across all prison types and jail type of systems, so across an entire incarceration process, and others are much more focused on the federal system or state prison systems and whatnot. And we're going to get into some of those policy suggestions and some statistics of incarceration rates and just how bad it has become in the United States of America. So this article is by the Charles Knox Institute, and it states why prisons matter in America. The American criminal justice system. American prisons house more than 1.5 billion individuals, an increase of more than 390% since 1978. This growth sustained even in the face of an overarching decline in crime rates since the 1990s. The longest terms of incarceration since we began to collect accurate data. Over 600,000 men and women are released from federal and state prisons each year. Upon release, these individuals will face many practical and social challenges to rejoining their communities. With current strategies used by our justice system to achieve rehabilitation and increase public safety have been ineffective, with more than 80% of those leaving our state prisons being re-arrested again in the future. Most Americans agree with the conclusion that can be drawn from these statistics. Something must change if we are to achieve an effective justice system that protects and enhances public safety while respecting human dignity. And I forget exactly what the term is right now in my head. Rejuvency or re-something, but it was that statistic there of 80%, and I have seen other statistics that suggest it's much higher than 80%, and basically that's the idea that what somebody who has served their term in a prison, to make this as simple as possible, has served their term in a prison. When I say prison, I'm talking about really any type of prison. So prisons to jails. I'm talking about everything when I say prison. Let's just say that so it's clear throughout. But as I was saying, I've seen statistics much higher than 80% of the rehabilitation rate, and the factor of that when people get out of these prisons, they end up coming back if they serve non-life sentences or even short sentences. I've seen the statistic that if somebody who has served in less than let's put it this way, if someone who served a year to 3 years in a prison, they have over an 80% chance of coming back to that prison in the future. So you might be thinking, well, shoot, something's wrong about that. Because most of the time when you talk about this prison reform and trying to change the justice system and trying to change the incarceration rate, you have people that say, well, the people that go to jail are bad. The people that go to these prisons are bad. We need to keep them there because what they did was wrong. And I don't necessarily think that anybody's wrong in having that opinion necessarily, especially when you start talking about people who committed violence in their state. or committed violence to end up in the jail or in the prison. But that whole argument has some merit to it, but the only problem with that argument is the factor of, well, if they're going to come back, then what really, there's something wrong about that. Yes, prisons ultimately have an uphill battle when they're trying to make somebody and have somebody better, because someone who goes to these prisons, someone that goes to these jails, ultimately the strategy should be to have a system, to have an idea, to have something in place so that you can educate whoever goes to that jail, whoever goes to the prison, be able to educate them so that they end up not in the future, once they get out, doing something worse off. And that's just not the case that we have right now. And there's several reasons as that might be, and problems with it, because ultimately, if you have a problem with your incarceration, so if over 80% of the people that were previously in your jail end up coming back to your jail in the future, then are you really helping the situation? And you could look at the crimes of the people that end up going to the jail and say, well, maybe if we pass this law that says that the person has this amount of, let's just say, weed on them, that they shouldn't go to jail. What if they have this much, then they should? In other words, if you bump up maybe the amount of drug possession someone has, and so that they end up don't going to jail for something like that. And that would be the approach of trying to change laws. But I don't really think that that's what a lot of people are talking about when they talk about when they talk about the criminal justice system. Ultimately, they're talking about the whole idea that when someone goes to these jails, there should be some sort of program in place to make sure when they get out of the jail that they're at least more educated and better off than they were before they went into the jail. Especially when you're talking about federally, because when someone goes to a federal jail and has a longer than 10-year sentence, or longer than whatever amount you want to put, but significantly longer than 3 years, you're talking about someone who has served in a maximum security prison for 12 years because of their crime, or because of their violence in the prison system, trying to maybe survive, or whatever you want to say. They come out and they've been institutionalized. And what I mean by that is they've gone through this prison system through such a vigorous schedule that says they have to do this, then they have to do this, then they have to do this, then they have to do this, and everything is controlled by the guards. In other words, any sort of freedom these people have in deciding what they want to do in the jail or in the prison has been taken away. When you go to a jail, especially a federal prison, you ultimately are having your choices completely taken away from you and determined by someone else, ultimately being the guard or the warden. So when these people end up going out into the public for the first time after their long sentence, they don't really know what to do. And there are several examples of this, where these incarcerated people who are now ex-cons and now free in today's society don't really know exactly what to do first. And they come back to their families, if they have a family, and they're ultimately bombarded with different concepts, different ideas, technology that they have never really seen before. So it's a very sad thing. And it leads to the stress being so much on the inmates, our former inmates, to do good, that sometimes the pressure becomes too much and they end up doing something that sends them back to the prison they just came from, or another prison like it. So if your prison system is ultimately just a storage, and ultimately you just want to send people that have committed a crime there for however long the justice system says they should be for, then you're ultimately treating prison as a storage, as I just said. So if you're somebody that wants to spend your tax dollars sending these people and paying for these people's food, paying for the prison system itself, paying the guards, paying the warden, paying basically, if you want to send your tax dollars to something that's just basically treated as a storage, and there's no programs trying to improve the situation, then what are you ultimately doing? You're not changing anything. You're not fixing a problem. Now, you may say you might be wasting your money spending on different technologies, different programs, different ideas, because these people may not want to change their ideas. The convicts may not want to go to these programs. They may not want to listen to these programs. So you're just wasting your time making these programs. But ultimately, I don't necessarily think that that's the best approach, because you would think the whole idea of a prison is not just a storage system. If you view prison just as being a storage system for criminals who did wrong, and that's all prison should be, then you ultimately see the same people coming back to this prison, and then you combine the same people coming back with people who commit crimes for the first time, and now you have the mass incarceration rate that we have in the United States. So you're not helping the situation. And that's one of the biggest problems when it comes to the criminal justice system. And I ultimately, and this is why I spent a lot of time talking about this before we move on, I ultimately think it comes down to how people view it themselves. Because I've seen many people who are, let's just say, harsher on the criminals and what they did, and that they need to take responsibility and serve the sentences, and all prison should be is a prison, and really we shouldn't be wasting our tax dollars on whatever program that might work. I've seen people talk about that, but I've also seen people who maybe were ex-cons talking about the system, or people that are a little bit more for justice reform, and stating that that whole process, that whole mindset doesn't really make sense. Because ultimately you're just creating a cycle, and this cycle keeps repeating itself. So if you want a cycle that just keeps repeating itself, then that's where you have something that exists in the American criminal justice system now. So it's just kind of sad. But let's see what the Charles Nahl says about prison reform. It says, what is prison reform? Prison reform is one remedy to the effectiveness of our justice system that many states and the federal government have explored. Prison reform is focused on ensuring public safety and resorting for those impacted by crimes through the creation of constructive culture within our prison system. These reforms seek to offer the circumstances of incarceration in ways that allow the system to model and incentivize the attitudes, behaviors, and lifestyles conducive to personalities, and self-control. Achieving these goals through prison reform usually falls within two broad categories. First, ensuring access to programs which help individuals gain knowledge, skills, job training, and positive values during their period of incarceration. Second, by revising correctional policies to ensure that minimum barriers exist to maintaining positive community relationships during the period of incarceration. By providing the individuals with opportunities to gain productive skills, equipping them to strengthen their positive relationships, we can help them to achieve their full potential and transform their lives upon returning to our communities. So there you have there with what I was previously mentioning, with the factor being trying to educate through a program or through an idea to hopefully help these inmates a little bit better and trying to get back into society. Because if you think about it, if you're someone that gets trapped in this cell, and that's the only thing they know for numerous amounts of years, and now they can go into the free world after they have gotten out, they're going to be a lost person. If you think about it this way, I'm trying to think of a good example, but ultimately, let's say if you had to, and this is a silly example, but this is the only thing I can really think that would be somewhat realistic to the world we live in today. But if you had to be stuck with the iPhone 7 or iPhone 8 and you couldn't upgrade your iPhone for, let's say, 12 years, your phone would now be completely old and completely useless, in quotations there, and there's going to probably be, in 12 years from now, some sort of technology that makes your phone look so subpar that people would wonder why you even have it. It's kind of the same concept for an inmate, except they don't even know what a phone is by the time they get out, because technology changes that fast. There's probably going to be something completely different to a phone or the idea, and everybody's going to have whatever this new technology is in 12 years from now, or there's just going to be something much more better than what we have now for sure. So it's that kind of that same concept. So we want to at least make sure that when an inmate is ready to leave the prison, that they have some sort of expectation to what they're getting into. Especially if you're talking about someone that is coming from a maximum security prison and maybe not someone who's coming from a camp or somewhere that's a lot less strict and a lot more open. But whatever prison you have, the inmates are going to experience similar situations, because what prison is taking your freedoms and your choices away from you. Even the lowest minimum security prison, despite them having less guards and maybe not armed as much or whatever the situation might be, it's still, the whole idea is taking your freedoms, your choices, your responsibilities away from you. Now, you still have responsibilities, but what I mean by that is you don't get the opportunity to choose anything when you're in a prison or a jail. You have your choices chosen for you. And that can become very hard to break when you go into the free ward without at least education towards what to expect and everything like that. So a lot of reform things we're going to read about, talk about simply having programs that prepare the inmate better to going into the free ward. But we'll read what their next thing about creating a constructive culture in prison. Because, we'll read what they have to say, because I think they sum this up very well. One of the arguments for prison reform has to do with reducing the number of people who are re-arrested. Upon leaving prison, those who have been incarcerated face significant barriers to the success upon returning to communities. It is estimated that in addition to the social stigma these individuals face, there are more than 48,000 legal barriers that bar them from securing employment, housing, occupational licenses, and many of the foundational things needed to be a productive member of any community. 74% of these men released from prisons are still searching for employment 8 months after the release. These many barriers negatively impact public safety and inhibit those with a criminal record from achieving their full potential. We're going to read about some statistics here, and then we'll move on to our next article, but I'll just briefly talk about the last thing, and we kind of were just talking about that, but the factor that when they go out of prison, they have a social stigma, as this article puts it, or some sort of problem that they have to face through. And there is numerous examples out there of ex-cons that have talked about their experience that state that because federally or because their states required that they put that they were a felon, that they get denied apartments or get denied jobs or get denied whatever because of simply that one factor alone. And that could ultimately just come down to the way hiring works in America, because if you have, let's just say, 4 candidates for this one job, even if you take like a dishwasher for a restaurant and you have these 4 candidates and one is a felon, one is I don't know. You have one's a felon and 3 of them are not felons, but maybe one doesn't know English or something like that, and the other 2 are high school students or whatever it might be. You have your 4 candidates. the employer is going to look at those candidates and say, which one do I think is the most reliable? Which one do I think is the person that's going to be the most productive? Which one do I think is not going to get in trouble? Which one do I think is going to represent my company, even if you are just a dishwasher for a restaurant? And ultimately, the felon has a high chance of getting marked off because they had because they were in jail. And if I believe right, at least from federal standard and job standards through OSHA, I believe it is, but I don't think you can necessarily ask what the crime was or know what the crime was. The only thing is that they have to put that you're a felon for most things. I believe that's correct, and somebody in comments will probably correct me if I am incorrect on that, if they make it to this point, if they're rewatching or whatever, but I believe that is the case. So because of that, they are probably going to get X'd out because of their prior history, and you have people who are much better candidates to the position and what the employer thinks. And that can come for several other things, even when you're talking about apartments. You may be the only person that's applying for this particular apartment, but that apartment holder, or whatever you want to say, that apartment company might look at your history and you having to put a felon and say, I don't necessarily trust this person living in my apartments because of their prior history. So there's a lot of that what inmates have to deal with, and I don't ultimately know if that would change from a prison system. That would be more changing prison culture and how America and how the world, how your state views prisons. And instead of seeing prison as simply a storage place, as seeing prison as an opportunity to improve people who may have grown up in a broken home or maybe got caught doing something they shouldn't have or escaping an abusive family or whatever the situation might be. Sometimes people in prison reform thinks that you need to change how people ultimately think of prisons. So that's something else that was kind of being mentioned there. But we're going to read a little bit about some statistics, and then we're going to move on to our next article about prison reform here. Prison reform statistics show benefits of prison programming. Evidence-based prison programming has been shown to reduce recidivism. That's the word I was looking for earlier. Recidivism. That's when they had to go back into prison. Anyway, save taxpayer expenditures, increase future employment for individuals who are incarcerated, and decrease rule violations in prison facilities. Here are a few prison reform statistics showing positive results when prison facilities provide programming or allow nonprofit organizations to approve such programming, to provide such programming. Mental health support in prison was found to reduce misconduct incidents by 22%. Substance abuse treatment in one California prison resulted in a 48% reduction in reincarceration. Last one holistic faith-based program reduced future reincarceration by 40% for those who graduated the program. Educational vocational lessons have been studied extensively and found to be some of the most effective programs in prison reform. Research shows that these types of programs reduce recidivism by 13%, reduce incident reports for prisoner misconduct by 4%, and increase post-release employment by 13%. Every taxpayer dollar spent on educational and vocational training programs for prisoners saves $5 on law enforcement and corrections expenditures in the future. So in other words, these taxpayer and some programs that have been implemented elsewhere in a state like California or just elsewhere in general have been proven to work here in the future. Have been proven to work in those examples and elsewhere. So that would be a whole idea or approach to why we should start some of those programs, or at least think about those programs more than we have in the past. But we're going to go to our next article about criminal justice reform here, and this is by the Equal Justice Initiative, and it states the United States incarcerations its citizens more than any other country. Mass incarceration disproportionately impacts the poor and people of color and does not make us safer. EGI, that's the Equal Justice Initiative, is working to end our misguided reliance on over-incarceration. And they have some statistics here. 25% of the U.S. has 5% of the world's population of its incarcerated population. $87 billion is the spending on jails and prisons, reached $87 billion in 2015, an increase of 100,000% from the $7.4 billion spent in 1975. So that is huge, because one of the biggest factors about prison and people who are kind of against prison reform, or at least skeptical of prison reform, is the claim that these prison systems are these re-education programs that aren't necessarily proven to work maybe the mass percent of time, but only, let's say, a third of the time, or even less than that, are a waste of taxpayers' monies. And that's where you ultimately have to go back to the perception of the issue as well, because I think that many people, as I've said earlier, simply view prisons as a storage place to host these inmates and criminals. And I don't necessarily know if that's the most educated thinking and reasoning to have, because I do think that spending money on re-education and different types of programs has the potential to help inmates a lot more than simply doing nothing and spending the taxpayers' money on other items. But the idea that you're simply wasting money through these programs doesn't particularly make much sense when we've seen the incarceration rate go up as high as it has been going, and the idea of having to go back to prison is so high as it is. In 1972, there were only 200,000 people incarcerated in the United States. Today, that number has grown to 2.2 million. So from 1972 to recent times, I don't know when this article was published. It doesn't have a date. Let me see if we go to the bottom here. It says 2021, but that's probably just the copyright. I don't know when these statistics are the latest. Oh, here we go. 2017. Looks like 2017. Yeah. This is from 2017 Bureau of Investigation Statistics. So from 1972 to 2017, we have gone from 200,000 people to 2.2 million. So this is once again going back to the argument. If you don't like the way your tax money is being spent on prisons, okay, here's I'll put it this way. I don't understand the people that view prisons as just a storage place for these criminals, because ultimately we've seen it through these statistics and ideas of mass incarceration and recidivism, the idea that these criminals end up going back to prison after they have left. So if this was the case, then why are we seeing so much more people and incarceration get so much more higher? So it ultimately is either two things. It's either the laws have gotten really stupid and are sending people to jail for really things they shouldn't be sent, and there is that argument, such as the drug wars, that gets talked about in justice systems. And the second idea is the way our systems work isn't improving the situation and is just hurting and causing more harm than good for the population and for people who find themselves as it's hurting the situation. And I think we see that with just how much people are in prisons. And ultimately, I think I would argue for both of those. I do think that some of the laws have gotten rather silly when it comes to incarceration, such as nonviolent drug offenders, as I have gone back to. Now, I personally am not too much a fan of drugs, really, for that matter, but I definitely take more of a libertarian policy approach when it comes to drugs, and that being the effect of drugs themselves shouldn't have laws against it, but if you do something on the drugs, then there should be a law against that. So in other words, if you have an amount of weed or you have an amount of cocaine, then really that shouldn't be illegal, and more should be illegal if you then do something with that. Or I don't know how distribution would necessarily work. I would still have to think about that in my mind. But ultimately, I don't necessarily think the nonviolent drug offenders and the policies we have in America now make much sense, and that has led to a large number of people going to these prisons. The next statistic we have here, from 1980 to 2017, the number of women in jails and prisons in the U.S. grew 750%. Over 225,000 women are incarcerated today. And I believe this is also from 2017. No, this is 2019 statistics. So there are now 225,000 women incarcerated today. And that may be, what am I thinking? Growing populations, because we have increased in population, obviously, since the 1980s. But obviously, I don't know if that ultimately makes too much sense when we're talking about that, because even if you include that into your analysis, that's still a massive 750% increase on what we are seeing through the criminal justice system. So I thought those statistics were really good at showing kind of the scale at what we are talking about when it comes to criminal justice. All right. Excuse me. This next topic is by the Prison Policy Initiative, and it states, new report, state-level criminal justice reforms that can win in 2020. State legislators can determine the future of mass incarceration. That's why we just published, as we do every December, a report on 20 plus winnable criminal justice reforms that state legislators can take on. We published this report as a PDF with links to more information and model bills, and we are soon to send this to state legislators across the country. This year, our list of reforms pipes for legislative victories includes eliminating probation fees and regulating privatized probation services, banning the Department of Corrections taking kickbacks from prison retailers, decreasing state incarceration rates by reducing jail populations, repealing effective and harmful sentencing enhancement zones, offering meditation assisted opioid treatment to reduce deaths in prison, protecting in-prison visits and letters from home in local jails, ending automatic driver's license suspicions for non-payment of fines and fees and for drug offenses and unrelated to driving, capping maximum probation terms, reducing or eliminating jail time for technical violations, and reducing barriers to housing for formerly increased people. And you can see their full report with more details and reasoning for those. But I thought I would kind of talk about some of those through ideas that can be passed from a state basis and statewide, because ultimately these changes are probably going to have to go more locally than being a government down process. We have seen a little bit of that through Biden's executive order cutting down on private prisons, but ultimately we have yet to see a real impact for changing justice reform Trump had a minor thing through a bill he signed, or I think it was a bill he signed for justice reform, but really there hasn't been that much on justice reform as far as the government goes. So it's ultimately a lot of times down to the state for deciding what to do when it comes to their state prisons and jails and the justice system. This next article is by the Southern Poverty Law Center and Criminal Justice Reform. It states here, over the past 4 decades, our country's incarceration rate, the number of prisoners per capita, has more than quadrupled and is now unprecedented in world history. Today, roughly 2.2 million people are behind bars in the United States, an increase of 1.9 million since 1972. We have the world's largest prison population, with 1/4 of its prisoners, but just 5% of the total population. And on any given day, some 7 million people, about 1 in every 31 people, are under the supervision of the correction system, either locked up or probation or parole. This vast expansion of the correction system, which has been called the new Jim Crow, is the direct result of failed decade-long drug war and law and order movement that began aimed in the urban unrest of the late 1960s, just after the civil rights era. It's a system marred by vast racial disparities, one of the segments and targets young black men for the rest of the young age, unfairly punishes communities of color, burdens taxpayers, and exacts a tremendous social cost. Today, African American men who failed to finish high school are more likely to be behind bars than employed. We're using litigation and advocacy to help end an era of mass incarceration, to root out social discrimination in the system, and to ensure humane constitutional standards for prisoners. So the Southern Law Poverty, what was it? I want to make sure I say it right. The Southern Poverty Law Center is somewhere that if you follow politics recently, you've probably heard of them at some point in your following of politics, because they talk about a lot of things, especially when it comes to racial injustice. And I thought this was a good point in also pointing out, we're not going to get too much into the statistics here of minorities who go into these jails, because it's not ultimately the focus per this video, but I'm definitely going to do something on that. And I don't know if my friend Jimmy's listening now, but he was talking on my Discord about doing something about talking about the poor and why ultimately they're disenfranchised at every level by the government. And I do think that I might be doing a stream kind of looking into that situation, and we could talk about some statistics there. But I do want to do a video just on the drug wars themselves, and we can get into a lot of those statistics as well, because ultimately a lot of these policing policies that came out from it, and government policies that came out of it, and racial profiling that came out of it was all kind of stemming from these drug war bills that got passed, because ultimately what happened was they said that the majority of people that were getting arrested were African American men for the most part, and these African American men are more likely to have drugs, so therefore we need to start arresting more African American men, or at least targeting more African American men compared to anybody else. So that's ultimately what have stemmed to so many more problems in our policing and justice system. But really, I don't want to, I want to spend a whole video just on that so that we can actually have spend a fair enough time talking about those issues, because I do think that there's a lot of problems in our justice system and in our policing when it comes to just that fact by itself. But we're going to read the end of this article here before we move on. Reforming policies that lead to incarceration of children and teens for minor crimes and school-related offenses. Working to transform a juvenile system that subjects children to abuse and neglect without providing necessary medical, mental health, educational, and rehabilitative services. ensuring that prisoners are more subjected to unconstitutional, inhumane conditions, and that they receive proper medical and mental health care, seeking to stop the prosecution of children, seeking to stop the prosecution of children in an adult criminal justice system and their incarceration in adult prisons and jails, advocating for rational policies and laws that help communities safe while vastly shrinking the prison population and reducing the social and economic impact of mass incarceration on vulnerable communities. So once again, they were kind of going back to those points, and I do think that that is a very good point to bring up when you're talking about the mass incarceration rate and prison reform itself and targeting minority communities. But we could ultimately spend an entire video just talking about that, and I am going to, because I do want to talk about those issues. I just feel like I won't be able to do it very good in this part of the episode. So we'll move on to this next thing. It's kind of some statistics and ideas of criminal justice that could be happening now, or ultimately should be happening now, and stuff we can start doing and start advocating for if you're someone that wants to see prison reform happen. So some top trends in state criminal justice reform in 2020, and this was published on January 15th, 2021, and this is by the Sentencing Project. The United States is a world leader in incarceration and keeps nearly 7 million prisoners under correctional control. More than 2 million are in prison or jail, and 4.6 million are under community surveillance on probation or parole. At least 19 billion prisoners are living with a felony conviction, while an estimated 100 billion have a criminal record. The persistence of extremely punitive sentencing laws and policies not increases crime rates, sustained the nation high rate of incarceration. Ending mass incarceration requires a transformative changes to sentencing policies and practices aligned with scaling back of collateral consequences of conviction and challenging racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Expanding prison release aimed at the pandemic. People housed in congregate settings like state prisons and jails experience higher rates of COVID-19 infections and mortalities than the general population. The cumulative infections among the increased residents are nearly 5 times higher than the general population. During the 2020 pandemic, several states took steps to reduce prison population levels. The National Academy of Science recommends that correctional facilities be reduced to the optimal population level of state prisons to follow public health guidelines. New Jersey lawmakers adopted Senate Bill 2519 to reduce state prison populations to improve public health practices. Specifically, the legislation authorizes public health emergency credits for any increased adult or juvenile within 365 days of their second release. Credits occur at the rate of 122 days every 4 months, a proportion of each month served during the declared emergency, with a maximum of 244 days. A reported 2,558 prisoners were released from state prison when the law went into effect. The Virginia General Assembly approved a proposed budget amendment sponsored by Governor Ralph Norman that authorizes the Department of Corrections to release imprisoned residents with less than 1 year left during the pandemic. Persons sentenced to Class 1 felony or sexual violent offense are excluded from the early release. As of December 2020, more than 800 prisoners were released from state prisons. In Washington, D.C., City Council members passed D.C. Bill 23-0735, an emergency measure focused on the pandemic. The law includes a provision that expanded eligibility for persons imprisoned for D.C. Code offenses who had served at least 20 years in prison, have served 20 years in prison. Individuals can cite their age, health, or other extraordinary and compelling circumstances as justification to petition the D.C. Superior Court for compensate release. So we have something to do with COVID and the releasing of prisoners due to the prison system wanting to allow for less population in the prison system within their walls, and how prisons are set up to reduce the amount of people that have of COVID-19 in the prison system. Because if you think about it, COVID-19 and the virus and just the way it is way more likely to spread in a prison than maybe somewhere else within that system. So that makes a lot of sense. We also have scaling back sentencing practices with Colorado. Colorado lawmakers repealed the state's death penalty statute with their adoption of Senate Bill 100. Sentences for offenses challenged before July 1st, 2020 are not impacted. Persons convicted of a Class 1 felony prior to the law are subject to death penalty now that the maximum penalty for this conviction is life imprisonment without parole. Oregon voters approved discriminalization Oregon voters approved decriminalization for possession of drugs like cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine with passage of ballot measure 110. The measure passed with 58.5% support. The measure also funds health assessments, addiction treatment, and other services for people with substance use disorders by relocating marijuana tax revenue and savings projected from scaling back drug enforcement. And you have another thing with North Carolina and California. California is definitely somebody who's pushed a lot more for prison reform than a lot of other states out there. And I've also heard a lot of people talking about what Oregon did and their prison reform technique of drugs, and that being a good idea, or an idea that a lot of states are paying attention to see what comes good and bad from that bill itself. Because the idea of decriminalization of hard drugs like cocaine and meth is something that we never have really seen before. Because I do believe other states like Colorado, I believe, they've decriminalized the possession of marijuana. I could be wrong, and someone in the comments would probably let me know if I am, if they watch this part. But I do believe that that is the case. Also, some states took a second look at extreme sentences and recognizing the capacity to change, such as Washington, D.C. and Virginia again, but Louisiana also stepped in here. Louisiana lawmakers ended juvie life without parole with the adoption of House Bill 173 for individuals who served at least 25 years and met other requirements, including education and other pre-release rehabilitation programs. Ohio policymakers are also eliminated juvie life without parole by adopting Senate Bill 256. Did you have challenging racial disparity? And this is, once again, California, as California's kind of been on top of that. And some other types of ideas, including second chance reforms with Michigan, South Dakota, North Carolina, and Vermont. We'll read about we'll read about where was I going? Oh yeah, North Carolina and Vermont. Take a deep breath. We'll read about South Dakota and Vermont because I don't believe we've heard from them. with second chance reforms. Legislators in South Dakota passed Senate Bill 96 and replaced the state's lifetime ban on temporary assistance for needy families, our welfare for residents with felony drug convictions. The measure builds on a previous second chance effort expanding food assistance. Alrighty, so you can read about all of the states there. We skipped over many of them, and California has kind of been on the top of many of those state lists. If you want to check that out yourself, if I can speak. But we'll go to our next thing about some federal crime statistics, because I thought we got some statistics, but I wanted to get a little bit better of a grasp at just how bad and what people are in prison for. Because when you think about it, you may be thinking, well, now that we know kind of what prison reform is and some ideas that might help the situation with prison reform, what are these people, convicts, criminals, whatever you want to say, in prison for? So that's where we are going to look at here. And this is the federal prisons, the BOP, as it's referred to, with the Federal Bureau of Prisons and their statistics, last updated January 16th, 2021. So banking, insurance, counterfeit, and embezzlement are 253 inmates. Why did I have it organized this way? That's so weird. All right, let's go from the highest down. Let's do the opposite. Let's go from the highest down. So we start from the highest with drug offenses. Drug offenses make up 66,115% of the inmates. And those who are listening to that number might be thinking, that seems like a big number. And I told you it's the biggest one. But if you're not looking, or you just close your eyes and just take a guess at how much you think the percentage of drug offenses are in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And you would probably say, I don't know, 30%, 40%, something like that. Well, 46.4% would be your answer. And that is just shocking, especially when you look at the second highest tier, which is weapon, explosives, and arson, and that only has 28,988 offenses, with only 20.3% of the the Bureau of Prisons population. So that is less than 0.5%. That is less than half of the amount of people that are on drug offenses. And that is the second highest amount of people in prisons, with 20%. And the third highest in the Bureau of Prisons is sex offenders, with 15,796 offenses and 11.1% of the population. So that kind of puts it into perspective about the drug wars, and that's why I want to have a stream just on that topic itself, because it has become such a huge issue. And before I started doing my research or paying more attention on this, I didn't really know that it had that amount of people, and that's why when people are pushing for legalizing weed in many states, it's ultimately partially because of the idea of what's happening in prisons and the Bureau of Prisons and whatnot. But we'll read out all the statistics, and I'm not going in any order now because their chart is very weird and not organized. I don't know why they did it this way, but they start with banking and insurance counterfeit embezzlement. That's 253 inmates with only 0.2%. Burglary, latency, property offenses, 7,282 with 5.1%. Continuing criminal enterprise is 290 inmates with 0.2% of the population. Courts or corrections is 496 with 0.3%. We read the drugs. Extortion, fraud, or bribery is 7,427 with 5.2%. Homicide, aggravated assault, and kidnapping offenses are 4,639 with 3.3%. Immigration is 5,601 with 3.9%. Miscellaneous is 884 with 0.6%. National security is 42 with 0%. Robbery is 4,781 with 3.4%. And we read sex offenders and weapons with being the second place and third place on the chart. So I thought that was rather interesting when it came to those statistics. But we're also going to go back to our site, Prison Policy Institute, and look at a little bit more statistics across the entire prison system and not just the Bureau of Prisons and being federal prisons, but looking more at the whole picture. So we go down to their chart here where it talks about state prisons and everything. And it says how many people are locked up in the United States. So in state prisons, we have 1,291,000 people. In federal prisons and jails, we have 226,000. And local jails, we have 631,000. And youth, we have 44,000. In terrestrial prisons, we have 11,000. In immigration and detention, we have 42,000. And in voluntary commitment, we have 22,000. So you might be thinking, well, what makes up these large numbers of people who are in state prison, with the state prison being 1,291,000 people? Murder makes up 183,000 of those. Manslaughter makes up 17,000. Rape and sexual assault makes up 165,000. Robbery makes up 169,000. Assault makes up 136,000. Other violent makes up 42,000. Other property makes up 25,000. Car theft makes up 10,000. Theft makes up 44,000. Burglary makes up 122,000. Fraud makes up 26,000. Drug possession makes up 45,000. Other drugs make up 145,000. Driving under the influence makes up 25,000. Other public order makes up 74,000. So when you talk about the big pies in state prison and like the category that they get defined under, would be 713,000 of them are under violent crimes, 227,000 are under property crimes, 191,000 are under drug crimes. So that is in state prisons. When you go to jails, who are people who may be waiting to go into a prison, such as maybe a county jail or something like that, there are 470,000 people who are not convicted. Those are the people who are probably waiting, versus the 161,000 of people who are convicted and in the process of doing whatever they're doing there. And they have the statistics of those as well. But the state prisons is really kind of the shocking one when it comes to that and everything related to there. Let's go down a little bit. They talk about some 5 myths. I think we'll read the headline and see if we want to talk about that or not. The 5 myths about mass incarceration. The first myth: realizing nonviolent drug offenders would end mass incarceration. It's true that police, prosecutors, and judges continue to push people harshly for nothing more than drug possessions. Drug offenses still count for the incarceration of almost 500,000 people. And nonviolent drug convicts remain a defining feature of the federal prison system. Police still make over 1 million drug possessions arrests each year, many of which lead to prison sentences. Drug arrests continue to give residents of over-policed communities criminal records, hurting their employment and prospects and increasing the likelihood of longer sentences for any future offenses. Nonetheless, 4 out of 5 people in prison or jail are locked up for something other than drug offenses, either a more serious offense or even a less serious one. To end mass incarceration, we will need to change how our society our society and our justice system responds to crimes and more serious than drug possessions. So that would tackle what I was saying a little bit earlier in the factor of that some people think all it would take or to at least help the situation would be getting rid of nonviolent drug offenders in the process of criminal justice. But where I kind of disagree with them on this article is ultimately you're trying to talk about something with helping the situation. And I disagree in the fact that if a state system or even a federal law were to say that you can't arrest people for this amount of possession or any possession necessarily of a drug, it would greatly reduce the amount of people that end up going to prison and the amount of people who are already in prison. We've kind of seen that with states who decided to lower their prison populations with COVID, as we were reading previously. Many of the people these states decided to release and allow them to now be ex-cons and not inmates of the system were people who were in that prison for nonviolent drugs or for drug possession. Because nonviolent drug possession. So I kind of disagree with them on there, but I do agree on the factor that you're going to need more than just getting rid of the people with nonviolent drug offenses or changing the law to reduce the amount of people that go into prison for these nonviolent drug offenses. But ultimately, I do think that you're going to have to do more than that, and you're going to have to change the way people view prison, because it does, once again, as I was saying all throughout my police reform video as well, it ultimately comes back to perception of how people view it. Because if people view jail as just being a storage system for inmates, then they're not really going to want to do anything to change that situation. And they don't really see programs that might help inmates as being something that we should attempt and we should try. So I do think it comes down to trying to change the perception, trying to change laws, trying to help prisoners more than what we are doing now to help this mass incarceration rate we have here in the United States. But we'll see what they say about their second myth here. The second myth: private prisons are corrupt heart of mass incarceration. So before they get into here, we're going to be talking about private prisons at the end of today's video and episode, or whatever you want to call it, because Biden did sign an executive order essentially removing private prisons, but there's many problems with his executive order and the concept of executive orders themselves, because as we'll get into later, I don't want to spill my beans too early when talking about the issue. When it comes down to it could be overturned rather easy, and we see with our first sentence here that the percentage of private prisons that exist is still very low. So just getting rid of private prisons isn't going to fix mass incarceration just by itself. But once again, it comes down to if you get rid of nonviolent drug possession holders, or whatever you want to call it, and you get rid of private prisons because of their bad motivations and what happens with private prisons, then ultimately if you mix the two and do both, then you are greatly helping in mass incarceration. But you can't just pick one and say that it has now solved all issues. Well, we'll read what they say here. In fact, less than 9% of all incarcerated people are held in private prisons. The vast majority are in publicly owned prisons and jails. Some states have more people in private prison than others, of course, and the industry has lobbied to maintain high levels of incarceration, but private prisons are essentially a parasite on the massive publicly owned system, not the root of it. Nevertheless, a range of private industries and even some public agencies continue to profit from mass incarceration. Many city and county jails rent space to other agencies, including state prison systems. The U.S. Marshal Service and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, private companies are frequently granted contracts to operate prison food and health services. Blah, 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 blah. So the idea that you can't just focus on that is kind of what we were previously just talking about. So nothing really new there. Their third myth here is prisons are factories behind fences that exist to provide companies with huge slave labor force. Well, there's a lot to talk about in here. It depends on how you view it. Because what prisons do is ultimately it's cheap labor. I don't know if you can necessarily call it slave labor, as the article was saying here, but it's definitely cheap labor. They still pay their prisoners in stamps so that they can use to buy foods or buy razor or buy whatever it might be. Whatever thing they need to serve themselves better in prison, they're still getting paid at a much lower rate than what they would be paid if they were in the free ward or anything like that. Like you see here with 86 cents per a day or 3.45 per day on most common prison jobs in 2017 study, as we see here. And I've heard many ex-cons talk about their process of, because most of the time these prisons require you to take some sort of job, and this job may pay, but the pay isn't exactly that great. So maybe it's not slave labor, but it's definitely cheap labor. But we don't necessarily need to get into those details too much, because that's not really prison reform. But I thought we would talk a little bit about the myths just because it was a little bit fun and break up the kind of depression that you get from reading these articles. But now I thought it would be a good idea to kind of compare the United States to the ward, because I mentioned several times throughout this podcast or throughout this episode that the U.S. for first world nations has the most amount of prisoners, the most amount of incarceration, the most amount of whatever, and it's the worst first world prison in first world nations. So out of Russia, so out of Finland, so out of Britain, so out of Canada, out of whatever nation you want to say, the United States is the worst. Now, is it the worst in an entire ward? No, because you do have third world nations that their prisons are, they don't even feed their prisoners or whatever it might necessarily be. So there are worse prisons out there, but that's like comparing apples to oranges. You have to compare the same sort of situation. So you look at it when compared to first world nations. So we'll read some statistics here, and this is by the Sentencing Project. The United States is the world leader in incarceration. There are 2.2 million people in the nation's prisons and jails, a 500% increase over the last 40 years. Changes in law and policy, not changes in crime rates, explain most of this increase. The results are overcrowding in prisons and fiscal burdens on states, despite increasing evidence that large-scale incarceration is not an effective means of achieving public safety. So you have here, U.S. Per capita is over 600, looks about 650. You have El Salvador, or EI. I don't know what EI is, because El Salvador is something else. But EI is just over 600 per capita. You have Salvador, which looks like it's about 470. Then you have Russia, that's just under 400. You have Brazil, that's about 330-ish. Australia, which is less than 200. All the way down to India, which is like 25 people per capita around. So you kind of have some broad comparisons to that. But then it also states here the U.S. state and federal prison populations from 1925 to 2018. We haven't hit it on this point yet, but I do want to talk also about this. It also comes down to the amount of people that view mass incarceration, because one of the big things that's getting pushed by prison reformers is the fact of what the U.S. was doing before to what the U.S. is doing now. And you see such a mass increase and such a large hill climb, such a large extension that is getting pushed for mass incarceration that doesn't make much sense. So like you can see here, in 1925, it was like 50,000 around. And then all the way till 1942, it had a big pump. Oh, I can move the thing. It was 91,669, in 1925. You go up to the next kind of slight big bump here in 1940, and it was 173,706. Then you go to a downhill spell back to a little bit up in 1962 with 218,830. Then at the start of 1976, the population was about 262,823, and you started to have a very large uphill climb till it stopped at about 2008 with 1,610,446. And then it had a slight downhill spell till the statistics end in 2018 with 1,414,162. But it is just such a large bound and uphill increase to think about and to discuss when it comes to prison reform and the idea of mass incarceration. So you might be thinking, how did this happen? A series of law enforcement and sentencing policy changes of the tough on crime era resulted in a dramatic growth in incarceration. Since the official beginning of the war on drugs in the 1980s, the number of people increased for drug offenses in the U.S. skyrocketed from 40,900 in 1980 to 452,964 in 2017. Today, there are many people behind bars for drug offenses than any number of people who were in prisons and jail for any other crime in the 1980s. Mass incarceration has touched all communities in inequality. Sentencing policies, implicit racial bias, and socioeconomic inequality contributes to racial disparities at every level of the criminal justice system. Today, people of color make up 37% of the U.S. population, but 67% of the prison population. Overall, African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested once arrested. They are more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they are more likely to face stiff sentences. Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men, and Hispanic men are more than likely to be incarcerated versus non-Hispanic whites. So it has some many more statistics just based on that, but I thought it was a very good idea at comparing us to the ward and what people see in other nations, on first world countries or even some second world countries that we were talking about. And then compare it to the United States, and also look at some United States statistics that we have seen such a large increase in incarceration from in the past, and that is what a lot of prison reformers are also talking about when it comes to our prison reform and wanting to change it for the better. I thought I would play this clip just to kind of break things up before we get into some scientific journals and some statistics from them, and then get into kind of our last topic. But I thought I would kind of break it up with this video just a little bit here.
Kim Kardashian West, thank you so much for doing.
I'm from my mom's glam room because I had
mom's glam room. Is that
my kids.
Behind you, or is that a piece of art? Is that your mom?
TV, and I don't know. It looks like a kettle, and it's just so bizarre. And then
I thought it was like a head or something.
No, it's so weird. I don't know why she has it, but we can snoop through her drawers if you want. It's just tons of makeup.
We're in the glam room.
I was like, okay, I can handle supporting someone that is nonviolent. Until I went to go visit prisons, and I started to meet with so many people that are incarcerated that shared their stories with me and explained to me that maybe when they were 14 years old, they did a horrific crime because they saw all of that growing up in their lives, and then is now locked away for the rest of their lives. But they've totally rehabilitated themselves and are now 30, 40, 50. And I heard this story so many times, and it just broke my heart that because people have done some horrific things, and I do believe people that do a crime have to do the time, but it's just a matter of like, what is fair? And yeah. I think our society really throws people away. So I feel like ultimately everyone just wants to feel safe in society, right? So when Alice came out, you saw her face and you understood that, okay, well, this is what reform looks like. She would be totally amazing in our society. But if you think about someone that had murdered someone, you wouldn't really think that. And so I wanted to kind of open the door to that as I was learning it myself.
Yeah.
Show a sex trafficking victim and show someone that had taken someone's life, or someone that had just been near someone that's taken someone's life and gotten more time than the person that actually used the weapon to kill someone. So just to kind of break down all of these really unfair things in our justice system was really important for me to hopefully have other people have empathy.
Yeah, it's got to feel good too when you do get someone who's been.
So she talked a little bit about a documentary that they made, but ultimately Kim Kardashian has been pretty good as far as criminal justice reform and trying to get people who are wrongfully committed, or I know that's the wrong term, but wrongfully sent to jail, out of jail, or reduce their sentence or whatever it might necessarily be. And she's done a lot of projects on that as well. I just forgot the name of the one project that she's been a part of that has a podcast and a website. Freedom something. Can't remember the name right now. I'll probably come back a little bit, but I thought I would quickly mention the Marshall Project as another resource if you want more information on it. They have many good resources and ideas and reforms that could possibly be done under the Biden administration or under their state administration or state legislators or whatever it might necessarily be. So I just thought I would give a quick shout out to the Marshall Project if you're interested in checking something else out about statistics and whatnot. We're going to get into our first scientific journal here, and this was Public Opinion About Criminal Justice Reform. Let me go down to the part I wanted to see here. I don't know why it changed the page I was on. Don't know why I did that. We'll just read the first part. The first part was good. I don't know why it changed from what I had, but oh well. Providing compelling evidence of public appetite for rehabilitation over increasing as a primary strategy for addressing crime. Nobody they find this to be true, even among those who live in a red state, and among those presumed to be at least open to less primitive options, politically conservative white males. The results of the Fio et al. Study speak not to the evidence or expertise of the scientific policy, but to the political feasibility of policy reform. The case for change has already been made. We know the current system of mass incarceration is at best a questionably effective in its efforts to reduce crime. After decades of seeming reluctance to purpose of criminal justice reforms that could be portrayed as anything other than tough on crime, anecdotal evidence abounds of a potential shift, including bipartisan collaborations between fiscal conservatives and social justice liberties at the state and federal level. Indeed, it has been widely argued that a shift occurring in our approach to criminal justice policy provides some public opinion context for this seeming shift. Most presumably, the research and public sentiment represents present an opportunity to reconstruct a public panel philosophy away from a simplistic and one-dimensional emphasis on toughness. Our simply policy-related recommendation based on research by Fio et al. Is to do just this. In fact, we will conclude with discussion of the row. First, however, we have two critiques we wish to raise about the research for the policy. The first raises question about the meaning of public opinion and its significance for policy. The second raises concerns about the kinds of public policies that may be most popular and how the framing of crime and justice encourages particular motivations for reform. So I just thought I would quickly kind of mention that as they go on to mention some ideas there. But ultimately, it was kind of interesting to hear that there are some examples of political reform happening across the aisle from people who ultimately you wouldn't think would see eye to eye, especially as the war becomes more politically motivated and more politically partisan. But we'll go to our next kind of scientific journal here through the Harvard Law Review. We're going to go to 848. Let me scroll down. Once again, it didn't save the place, but we are okay. Okay. There's stories and challenges they face. I wrote an op-ed that highlights the heartbreaking consequences of placing young people in solitary confinement. Of course, there are limits to this approach. Presidents are not primary citizens. We need to be careful about speaking about legal materials before all the facts are in, even if it appears that everyone else in the United States is commenting on them. Public attention to criminal justice, particularly in the area of policing, is often driven by pending investigations of cases in which the facts are still being gathered. Oftentimes it is a viral YouTube video that leaks in the evening news, incidents, protests, and drives calls for reform. Like millions of others, I would watch these videos, but the office makes it difficult to comment on the way a journalism activist would, without being accused of prejudging the facts or influencing the legal process. The White House Data-Driven Justice Initiative, the Police Data Initiative, are two examples of how the federal government can advocate solutions at the state and local level by supporting eviction and binding together community reformers. The focus of the DDJ is on reducing unnecessary jail stays. Over 11 million people move through the county 3,100 local jails each year, many of whom are charged with low-level, non-violent misdemeanors. Keeping this population in jail costs the local governments an estimated $22 billion a year in incarceration costs alone, in part because of the high number of jail inmates who are in need of treatment for mental illness, a substance use disorder, or chronic health problems. Much of this cost is driven by small populations. Studies have a relative small number of highly vulnerable individuals cycle repeatedly not just through local jails, but also hospital emergency rooms, shelters, and other public systems. To taxpayers nationwide, slightly more than 1 in 20 individuals have some form of mental illness. In 2005, more than half of the incarcerated population did. Data from 2012 finds that 15% of prisoners and 26% of jail inmates experience serious psychological distress. Across the country, communities are recognizing that there are better and more cost-effective solutions. A good example of reform can be found in Miami-Dade County, Florida, where the county combined data across their healthcare and criminal justice systems and dissolved, and just 97 people with serious mental illness accounted for $13.7 million in services between 2010 and 2014. These few dozen people spent more than 39,000 days not in treatment but in jails, emergency rooms, state hospitals, or psychiatric facilities in their country. The DGJ allowed the White House to bring together a bipartisan coalition of city, council, and state governments with the support of broad range of nonprofit organizations, private sectors, institutes, philanthropists, and universities in an effort to expand these kinds of better alternative activities. The response to the DDJ has been overwhelming. At this time, a total of 139 state, counties, and cities, converting almost 100 million Americans, have agreed to participate and to begin putting these strategies into practice. Of the different communities, so they can learn from one another, we want to go to the actual strategy. Let's skip a little bit here. They make this very hard to navigate. But we will find where I wanted to go here. I think we're good. We can move on for this one. Ultimately, they started talking about some of the results from their strategies, and there seemed to be some effectiveness towards it, but they couldn't ultimately say, like many scientific journals, that using just their strategy would ultimately work fully, because they kind of have to be more scientific in their approach and in their process, so they can't ultimately come out and just say that fully without there being some sort of maybe consequence or something like that being related to it. A quick break while we wait for this to load. I don't know if anyone's watching right now, but I have 2 videos by the same guy, and I've been debating ultimately if I want to listen to both of these videos. They talk about a similar subject, a similar idea, but I don't know if they ultimately need to both be played or I'll just play the one. So if anybody is here now, if you want to hear both of them, I'll play both of them. I'll still have it up just in case. They're both valuable. They're both linked in my YouTube channel description. But I don't ultimately know if everybody wants to hear that or not. I don't know if you still hear CHYPH3R Cypher? I'm going to go with Cypher. I don't know if you're still here on Trovo Cypher. If you are, thank you for joining the channel. Hopefully you liked what you heard and everything on Trovo there, and I would appreciate if you do to give me a follow. I just started here on Trovo, but I like it so far for sure. So I would highly appreciate that if you're still here. If you have any questions, if you have any questions, definitely feel free to ask me, and I'll try to answer your question to the best of my knowledge or find an answer here for you. But ultimately, I don't know if I want to necessarily play both. If you want to hear both, I'm definitely willing to play them. They both have very good points, but they are linked in my channel description on YouTube and also in my Discord under article stream news or article news, whatever I named that channel, but they are both linked there, so you can definitely find those videos or any other article on what I talk about on those channels. But we're going to come back to this scientific journal because these scientific journals can get a little bit exhausting. But we're going to go to Bernie Sanders' plan. Now, Bernie Sanders is no longer running for president of the United States of America, obviously. He got defeated, and Biden and Harris are now president and vice president as of last week-ish ago. I think it's been a little bit more than a week now. But Bernie Sanders, one of his biggest push was for his criminal justice plan. And as we all know, Bernie Sanders is very left and pro-communism or pro any of the progressive left words you want to ultimately use. Excuse me. But I thought it was very interesting to compare his plan to some of the ideas and considerations or topics we were reading earlier in my discussion here and in our articles and in our scientific journals about reform ideas that we could potentially use in America or in the United States to have a better system. So Bernie Sanders' key points for criminal justice reform are ending for-profited greed in our criminal justice system top to bottom by banning for-profit prisons and detaining centers, ending cash bail and making prison and jail communications, re-entry, diversion, and treatment programs free, ensure due process and right to consent by vastly increasing funding for public defenders, and creating a federal formula to ensure populations have a minimum number of public defenders to meet their needs. Cut the national prison population in half and end mass incarceration by abolishing the death penalty. 3-strike laws and mandatory minimum sentences, as well as expanding the use of alternatives to detention. Transform the way we police communities by the end on war on drugs by legalizing marijuana and exposing past convicts, treating children who interact with the justice system as children, reversing the criminalization of addiction and ending the reliance on police forces to handle mental health emergencies, homelessness, maintain violations, and other low-level situations. Reform our decrepit prison system, guarantee a prisoner's Bill of Rights, and ensure a just transition for incarcerated individuals upon their release. Reverse the criminalization of communities in cycles of violence, provide support to survivors of crime, and invest in our communities. And the last one here, ensure law enforcement accountability and robust oversight, including banning the use of facial recognition software for policing. So some of the ideas are a little bit more radical than others. Some ideas are what we've read previously on some state reforms that have been done in the past, or concepts like that. But others are definitely a little bit more progressive leaning, for lack of better words, than other policies. I'll go back up, see... The idea of Xing out mandatory minimum sentences, I have heard from a lot of ex-cons and channels and police reformers as well, being basically the concept that if we do get rid of mandatory minimums and the pressure put on by senators or whatnot, or not senators, but prosecutors and the justice system for having to put a mandatory minimum or having to put a minimum sentence, it might be a little bit better to help the situation of the amount of people that simply go to prison for X amount of years when really they might have done the crime, but it wasn't as bad as, say, the person next to them that did the same thing, just a little bit worse, or whatever the case may be. So most of Bernie's plans there are very similar to some justice reforms that you read on a lot of these websites and policies that people are suggesting, especially when you're talking about trying to end the war on drugs through legalizing marijuana possession, but not necessarily the act of what someone might do under the drug, because the act itself is still something a lot of people say people should go to prison with. So in other words, if you have marijuana but you don't do anything, then you shouldn't be arrested. But if you have marijuana and you do something, well, then you need to be arrested, because it's your act what matters, not necessarily what you have in your pocket, or whatever you kind of want to say for that. So a lot of Bernie's plans are very similar to what some prison reformers were talking about. And ultimately, I think you would have to know a lot of the details of how Bernie plans to go about it to know how, for lack of better words, progressive he gets in it to the situation and trying to fix the problem. But the way the prison system is now and how Bernie wants it and how a lot of prison reformers want it looks very similar. So I thought I would kind of point it out because I found it a little bit interesting. And I definitely agree with some of what Bernie says through his prison reform plan, but I would have to know more details and ideas on exactly how he plans to go about it to come up with a full kind of solution towards it. Now, we're going to get into my first video by Larry Lawton, and he talks about the idea of private prisons. Yes, I know, I just forgot his name, Joe Biden is ended private prisons by executive order. And there are many issues on that act alone, because that isn't necessarily going to solve the problem just by itself, because there's many issues with having it as an executive order, but we're going to get to that topic. But I first thought I would give this video because it shows you a very good idea to why private prisons are ultimately bad and something that should be removed because of these reasons.
Larry Lawton, America's biggest jewel thief. Join me as I walk you through my past robberies, how I planned them, executed them, and ultimately got caught. I'm going to show you how we did things in prison, like making a tattoo gun, making wine, making white lightning. It's going to be very educational. These are the untold stories.
Hey everybody, Larry Lawton here, and here's another edition of Untold Stories. But it's going to be a little bit of a rant because I kind of got mad doing what I was doing the other day, doing research for the other video I did. But, you know, before you get started, if you like our videos, make sure you share them, and also put them in your playlist. You know, if you like Gangster Redemption book playlist, put it in your playlist. I'll have other people look at the playlist as well. We really appreciate all your support. Make sure you check us out and all the stuff in the description below, whether it's for Instagram or Facebook or wherever, and we got a lot of good stuff coming on that. Let me get right into my rant. You all know I do a lot of legal work, and I was talking to my buddy Paul Tellini the other day, and Paulie and I were on the phone for a couple hours, 2 hours, just ranting and raving about the stuff we saw in prison. And I'm going to have Paulie on as a guest for sure. He's going to be coming on with the Prison Pasta Show for sure. But you know, there's a lawsuit. This is one of the lawsuits that I filed from the last video. You know, you saw a few weeks ago or a few episodes ago of the masturbation stuff. And I read the whole case again, and it's blowing me away of what's going on. So I did some more research, and I'm going to tell you what really got me to an uproar, if you want to call it. You young guys out there, I really want you to pay attention to what I'm going to tell you. You don't want to go to prison, and I'm going to tell you why. Yes, it sucks. You're going to lose your family. You're going to lose your kids, and there's nothing worse than that. And you don't even get it yet, but you will. I just want you to pay attention to what I'm saying. The way they treat human beings in these places is terrible. I talk about the warden, John LaManna, who's a piece of garbage, who went after me. In fact, I think now he's even working for a private prison. I'm not sure, but I'm going to still do more research. And I ended up starting to doing some research on private prisons. And, you know, I have some people come to this show, and in the comments, they'll say, why are you against private prisons? Well, here's the bottom line. How can you argue with me that private prisons are good when they make profit off the misery of your sons and daughters and everybody included? And listen, you know, I had a great question. Why should people care?
So that's an interesting concept there, which I think a lot of people think about, but ultimately some people kind of need to be told the question, or at least told the idea, to think about something to think about the concept like this, because a lot of people don't want to necessarily go down the rabbit hole of having bad thoughts or questioning what already exists, because it's very easy to basically ignore prisons, ignore jails, ignore convicts who are in these jails, because we don't really see these jails every day, unless you happen to drive past one to your work or something like that. But you don't really see, these jails every day. So unless you're kind of thinking about justice, or thinking about the court system, or thinking about jails, or thinking about whatever it might be, you don't really necessarily think about private prisons or what the prison life necessarily is. So it's kind of interesting too that he brings up that question, because it does make you think a little bit, and at least put a little bit more thought. You may have thought about it before, but I don't know. It's hard to really say if a lot of people ultimately think about the life of a prisoner very often, because I think it's very easy to ignore. We'll play this video here again.
Great question. Why should people care about like an axe murderer or a person in prison? And trust me, I have my heart, against certain things that people do to people, and it makes me frustrated, gets me mad, makes me want to do something to somebody. But listen, let's take it down, break it down. First of all, everybody in prison is not bad. 95% of all people in prison, or even more, are getting out. They're gonna be out. So even if you don't like them, let's just say you don't have humanity in you. I hope you do, because that's the number one reason. We're humans. We're in the human race. We're not animals. This isn't pack animals where a bear will kill some cubs, or a lion will kill the male cubs of another female to keep his power. We are a human civilization, and we should care. We really should. And that's number one. Number two, it's funny how when I talk to officials, and I know a bunch of them, from the Bernie Kuricks, who was a New York City police commissioner, and he was the head of corrections. He ends up going away to prison because he embezzled money and a whole bunch of other stuff he went to prison for. And now he got out, and now he's all for prison reform. Why weren't you like that when you were out? Obviously, I'm not going to really bash him, because at least he's trying to do something. And I wish more officials would listen to guys like myself, and even now the Bernie Kuricks of the world, who are against the harsh prisons the United States has. And how do you put a private prison in charge of people? One person said, well, I work for a private prison, and they're not that bad. He goes, some of them, they do care. So I asked him, I said, so where do they save their money? He says, well, on food. I mean, my first thought was on food. So you're saving money on food? There are some estimates that they feed a human being, for 50 cents a day. 50 cents a day they're feeding people. And, again, we do have people who say, some of them deserve not even to be fed.
I laughed at that a little bit, because it's like, I know already what like the prison food system is, especially if you watch any sort of like documentary about prison life or anything like that. You see kind of the food lines, and even sometimes some movies or TV shows kind of show you a little bit. A lot of times the TV shows and movies glamorize it a little bit, but the food itself is just awful. So it's like, to save money on food just is a hilarious thought, because it's already like as cheap as you can get. Like, it's basically cafeteria food, what the cafeteria doesn't care about you. So it's even worse than just traditional cafeteria food. So it's just kind of funny that would be the process, are the one thing that you do to kind of save money on. Smite Knight. I think I said that right. I am terrible at reading names on Twitch. Anyway, they say his first point over lack of empathy is hard to fix. Typical conservative logic is nothing is a problem until it affects me. I generally don't know how to fix that issue. Yeah, like, I don't know if you were here in my police reform video, because I did police reform and now I'm doing justice reform. And I might do one on the drug war next, just to kind of keep this theme going a little bit. But ultimately, I argue for both of these videos that it comes down to perception and how people view inmates and how people view prisons. Because I think a lot of people simply see prisons as storage facilities, and all we're really doing with prisons is just putting these criminals in a storage place, literally, because it's a cell, and don't care about them, and we don't need to care about them, because it's just a storage facility. You get what I'm saying. And some people on the other end see prisoners and criminals, convicts, whatever word you want to use, as more humane and want to give more reform policies, justice policies, whatever you want to say, to try to help the situation. Because as we were reading earlier, there is numerous statistics about people that come out of prison, even if they just served 1 to 3 years and end up going back into the prison and repeat the cycle. It's called recidivism. And recidivism, yeah. And basically the idea that once they get out, they go back in. And that's just the cycle repeating itself. So if you keep having a cycle repeating itself and you have more people committing crimes, your rate of incarceration is just going to keep climbing. And we've also seen the same statistics about that, especially when it comes to drug possession and laws like that. You see a huge spike, this huge curve in statistics and people who go into these prisons off of the drug wars. And that's why I want to spend a episode just on drug wars itself and try to understand that, because ironically one of the people that was head of the tough on crime bills is now the president of the United States, and Joe Biden, and he has passed a recent bill that we're going to be talking about soon after this video on private prisons, because he now has an executive order that bans or prevents private prisons, or whatever word you want to use. But there's problems with that executive order, and we're going to get to those. But I first wanted to kind of finish out this video so that you can understand kind of the problems behind private prisons, and I thought it was better to kind of break it up with a video because I thought he explained himself very well instead of reading more articles about it, because we've already read a whole bunch of articles, and that could get a little bit boring.
They're scumbag. I get it, I really do. Because there are some crimes to this day that just eat at me, and I want to kill the dude. And trust me, they're not doing well in prison themselves either. Those people end up dying, whether it's Jeffrey Dahmer, who ate people, he ended up getting killed on the prison yard in Massachusetts. How about Whitey Bulger? Whitey Bulger was a piece of garbage, ordered murders, was an informant, did everything. Went to prison, he didn't last a day in a federal prison, maximum security, that I know the people were in that prison.
Hey, see
and
the
I
noise?
don't know the ones
and
who
yeah,
did
I love
them
how he
to
says
them. I know
garbage.
people
It's hilarious.
in that prison
Garbage.
at the time that it happened. So I know firsthand knowledge. That was set up and ready to go right from Jump Street. That guy wasn't going to last a week. He didn't last a day. And they tried to cut his tongue out. They jabbed his eyes out. Talk about dying in a brutal way. Listen, I don't condone any.
Oh, we got an ad break. I love ads.
Violence on anybody. I really don't. I was a bad guy at one time in my life. Not anymore. But what got me so into...
See, if Noise says, the dude's accident just told me to step out of the car. That's how you say it, the car. I have somebody who's from Wisconsin, I believe, but he was originally from Boston, and he always, when he's talking, occasionally goes into his Boston accent, and he's like, I get out of the car. It's very, it's funny to me. But yeah, he definitely has this accent. He's originally from New York, but I think he lives in Florida now, if I remember right. But it was just hilarious because... Anyway, yeah, his accents are funny, especially his accent.
Rant and got me so into this thing in the prison system. And listen to me, we all know I'm all for prison reform. And until, well, I'm trying to get myself thoughts together because I'm getting mad in a way. You know, the first thing everyone asks me, what's the single best thing you can do to stop, the prisons? There's a way, and I'm going to explain it in this tape, how we can fix prisons for good. First of all, get rid of the profit margins in prison. Let me give you some numbers. The two biggest companies in prison, private prison industry, are CoreCivics, or it used to be CCA, Correction Corporations of America, CCA. Now it's called CoreCivic. They just changed their name. And the other is GEO, capital G, capital E-O, the GEO Group. And they are huge companies. And let me tell you the numbers and tell you why it's getting worse. In 2015, their revenue was $1.84 billion. $1.84 billion. 16, it went to $2.18 billion. In 2017, it went to $2.26 billion. In 2018, it went to $2.33 billion. And now in 2019, it's $2.48 billion.
So you have those statistics there. I'm going to go back a little bit so that we can see it a little bit better. Play it again.
2018, it went to $2.33 billion. And now in 2019, it's $2.48.
So we're still waiting for the 2020 statistics since it just turned to 2021. Yes, it's almost a month later, but you know they're going to be slow with giving them their data with any sort of government, although this is a private business, same concept. So I will stop it here real quick. The idea of private prisons themselves, and he's going to get into this a little bit, is a little bit suspicious of a concept because ultimately it's a private businesses operating, trying to survive on a profit margin or trying to making money off of basically keeping people in storage facilities is kind of how I think about it. So as soon as you have a prison system, and say it's a private prison, the idea of any private business is then to make money. When you talk about a government system like government prisons or federal prisons, yes, their idea, they still operate similar like a business because they still need to at least meet even in their profit margins. They can't necessarily go negative, or the prisons are just going to go away, and we still need these prisons. But their ultimate motive isn't necessarily to make profit. But as soon as you turn it to a private prison or a private business or whatever, you then are turning the motivation to flipping the script and only having that to your only motivation to having it as private is to then make money as that business. So essentially you're making money off of, as I said earlier, a storage facility of storing these people. And that concept has a lot of people bothered. And also in private prisons, the regulations aren't always the same as federal prisons. So they can still cut costs in other ways, such as maybe not as a fire extinguisher or the things on the ceilings that spray the water. Can't remember. I guess it is a fire extinguisher, but not the way I'm thinking of it. So that is kind of a funny thing when we talk about that point. Viable Clan member says, have you seen Orange is the New Black? Is a private prison from that show accurate? I have not seen the Orange is the New Black, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question for you. But I don't think that any necessarily TV show, because I believe that is a TV show. Yeah, it is a TV show. Like, I've heard of Orange is the New Black, but haven't seen any episodes. But as any prison TV show, you're not ultimately seeing a perfect representation of what a private prison would look like or a prison would look like necessarily. It's still a glamorized version. But I do know from what people have told me about Orange is the New Black is they try to be at least a little bit more realistic compared to other types of private prisons or other types of prisons out there. So there probably are some truths to the Orange and the New Black and their type of private prison and how it operates to the actual truth of private prisons that physically exist now and not being shown on television, if I'm making sense. So in other words, there's probably some examples in that TV show of real private prisons and some examples that are a little bit glamorized. But we'll continue on with this video. But I might be able to watch it. So if you come back, I don't know, next episode, I might be able to answer that question a little bit better for you. But I would have to look at the episodes myself.
$8 billion. And that's their own financial statements. That's their own filings. So they can't hide it. Now, their profit in that margin was in Geo, the profit was $166 million profit. That's after paying everybody, paying the expenses, writing everything in the world they can think of, paying the CEOs, the wardens, every guard, every person, feeding the inmates, equipment, costs, cars, you name it. They have a profit of $166 million. Here's irony. They're based in Florida, down in Boca Raton, Florida. I went down there. I went into one of the prisons they run. And the staff there, they do the whole stuff. And I went in to speak to the inmates in the prison. And it was a big crowd, a couple hundred people. And I talked about reentry and having hope. It was a business stuff. Some really good people with a big heart brought me in to try to talk to the people. And I felt so bad for the inmates in there. And now I told the dude I can't do that anymore because I'm not going to support this prison. They don't even want to pay for a program for people. They don't want to pay for anything. Their big line? We don't have money. We don't have money. They profited $166 million.
That's their
Tell me
take-home pay.
what their bottom line is. They want to make money for their shareholders, and I get that. But that's why we can't have private prisons in the United States, because their whole thing is making money. And how do you make money on another person's suffering?
Sorry. He was not one of the pause. But yeah, that's their take-home pay, their profits take-home. I'm sure everybody knows that who's at least watching, but essentially their profit margin and what he's talking about there is you have your number and then you have your cost. Your cost take out your original profit or whatever you want to say, and then your take-home is your end profit, and that's the number of their take-home pay. So they have millions of dollars of take-home and pure profit that they can use. So the fact that they have that amount of money to pay their CEO, guards, and everything is so much higher than what he thinks it should be. And he's going to go on later to describe some ways to spend this money a little bit better for his program. So we'll let him kind of talk about that. But I just wanted to make that clear in case anybody was ultimately confused on that. I don't think you probably are, but just in case.
I think that's terrible. I really do. It breaks my heart to think that there's dudes in that prison not eating right, maybe getting beaten. And let me explain what I mean. How do they cut costs? Well, at nighttime, you have 2 units. So you'll have an A unit, a B unit. And they'll have 1 guard on at the night shift for both units. So if some guy's getting beaten in his cell and the guard is in the other unit, they can't hear it. They don't know what's going on. Now, if they had a guard stationed in that unit and they heard the ruckus, they can go help that guy. They can call for backup. But at this point, right now, the guard is in the other unit or whatever unit he is. Maybe he's going to the bathroom. Maybe he's doing something. And now that guy is half beaten to death because they couldn't get people to him. Even that, what happens if the guy's having a medical episode? There's no guard. There's nobody to him. He's banging on the door. He's screaming for help. Help me, help me. The guy's got such pain, whether it's chest pain, maybe he's bleeding, internal bleeding. I watched a friend of mine. Took him 30 minutes to get him out of a cell. 30 minutes. And they had a guard there. And that was in Edgefield, South Carolina. And he ended up dying. His name was Schiff, and it was a sad case. The blood was all over the cell. My point is, where are they going to cut costs if it's a private prison? If it's an American prison, if it's a government-run prison, they're not worried so much about the cost. They do have to worry about costs, but at least they hire that person and that guy's job is in that unit or whatever the number of people. We all know the regulations they put out. Now, they call those the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. That was my expertise, understanding the CFR on what prisons can and can't do to you by their own CFR, regular Code of Federal Regulations, which is set down by policy. How the Code of Federal Regulations go is this. Laws are passed, whatever they are, and the Constitution is followed. And it goes from there, and then it goes to different policy groups who set policy. Now they set policy in line with whatever the lawmakers decided and whatever the Constitution states. Of course, that's the overriding thing. Whether it's cruel and unusual punishment, the 8th Amendment. Well, let's define cruel and unusual punishment. Do you think trying to feed people on 50 cents a day is cruel and unusual? Do you think putting 3 men in a prison cell that's 8 foot by 10 foot cell and putting 3 men in there, maybe 4 men in there, is cruel and unusual? Supreme Court said.
No, I was going to try to pause it before that. Oh, well. I was going to ask everybody who's listening now if you thought that was cruel and unusual punishment, because I didn't originally know till this video, and I looked into it a little bit, but that the Supreme Court did rule on those cases that they were examples of cruel and unusual punishment in the prison systems and whatnot. So the Supreme Court has come and said that those are examples of that. So I thought that was rather interesting, and I did not know that till this video.
That it is. What else is cruel and unusual? Is it cruel and unusual to sentence a 15-year-old to life without extenuating circumstances? The Supreme Court said it is. My point is, this is how the Code of Federal Regulations are made. So then the Attorney General of the United States approves those Code of Federal Regulations. They go out down to the Bureau of Prisons. Then even their prison policies go in line with the Code of Federal Regulations. So when they break their own policy, in fact, they're violating their own Code of Federal Regulations. And that is against the law. That has been proven on many cases as well. I've had them come and say, oh, they're only guidelines. No, they're not. They are policies set down by lawmakers that you are supposed to follow. Well, then you get guys like John LaManna, a piece of garbage, who had it out for me. He literally mentioned my name in meetings saying we have to shut this guy up. They tried. They didn't do it. Sadly, there are other people in prisons right now going through some very bad times. And of course, I'm filming this right now at 3:55. It's 3:55. And it's sad because in 5 minutes, every single federal inmate in the time zone of 4 o'clock will be standing on his feet for a mandatory count. And I think of that every day at 4 o'clock because I know what they're going through. I know there's guys getting beaten right now. And everybody's going to say, not everybody's going to say, oh, some of them are scumbags. Yes, they are. But listen, you should care. One, because it could be you. If you go 20 miles over the speed limit and you're driving a car and you happen to run into a lady, car that swerved, something happened, and you were 20 miles over that limit and you hit that car and that lady died, you, my friend, are going to prison and you might be in the cell with me. And that'd be good because I wasn't a predator. But you might be in a cell with a predator and then you got to watch out. Not only that, those people in prison are somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's husband, somebody's wife, somebody's mother, and somebody's father or grandparents. Those people have extended families. And trust me, not everybody in prison is this bad, evil guy. I want to believe that I was never a bad, evil guy. I don't say I didn't deserve to go to prison. I always said it. I deserve to go to prison. I did my time. But let's face it, people, we have to do what we're doing because if we keep letting this go on, it only gets worse. And then, what is it going to take? Is it going to take a riot? Is more people going to die? At what point in this whole cycle of abuse is, people... Let's talk about what really goes on. How come certain minority groups are in prison at a higher rate? Think about that. Because they don't have the lawyers, they don't have the connections? That's bullshit. I'm all for guidelines, but I'm not for stuff that keeps people in prison unnecessarily. I always say that. We have to have good judiciary. We have to believe in the judges. We have to all start this with the cops. The cops themselves got to start being more human and more compassionate and more understanding of what a case is. That's a guy that deserves to go to prison because he's really doing something bad.
So he kind of talks a little bit more, but we kind of got through most of the big concepts here for that video and over the numbers that these private prisons make and how they kind of cut costs. And he mentioned an example of the wing. So 1 guard per a wing when it comes to at nighttime or other times. And that is problemsome because there could be a fight that breaks out in the other wing of the prison and the guard would be completely unable to do anything about it because he's on the complete opposite side of that wing to potentially do something to help the situation. So that is a little bit crazy as well when we talk about the justice system and the justice reform. But now we're going to get into our last kind of topic I wanted to bring up for our justice reform stream. And that being the most recent example, excuse me, hit my knee on the desk. Ow. I'm getting to the most recent example of what has happened in our politics about Biden, because Biden recently has passed an executive order putting an end to use of private prisons, as the Associated Press puts it in their headline here. And that is very big news for Biden and his administration, because it has pretty big meetings and a small victory for justice reformers, even though it is through a executive order. But we'll read what the Associated Press has to say about it here. President Joe Biden on Tuesday ordered the Department of Justice to end its reliance on private prisons and acknowledge the central role government has played in implementing discriminatory housing policies. In remarks before signing the orders, Biden said the U.S. government needs to change its whole approach on the issue of racial inequality. He added that the nation is less prosperous and secure because of the storage of systemic racism. We must change now, the president said. I know it's going to take time, but I know we can do it, and I firmly believe the nation is ready to change, but the government has to change as well. Biden rose to the presidency during a year of intense reckoning on institutional racism in the U.S. The move announced Tuesday reflects his efforts to follow through with the campaign pledge to combat racial injustice. Beyond calling on the Justice Department to curb the use of private prisons and addressing housing discrimination, the new order will recommit the federal government to respect tribal sovereignty and disavow discrimination against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community over the coronavirus pandemic. Biden directed the Department of Housing and Urban Development in a memorandum to take steps to promote equality housing policy. The memorandum calls for HUD to examine the efforts of Trump regulatory actions that may have undermined fair housing policies and laws. Months before the November election, the Trump administration wrote back an Obama-era rule that required communities that wanted to receive HUD funding to document and report patterns of racial bias. In order to end the reliance on privately run prisons, directs the Attorney General not to renew Justice Department contracts with previously ordered criminal detention facilities. The move will officially revert the Justice Department to the same posture it held at the end of the Obama administration. This is the first step to stop corporations from profiting off an incarceration, Biden said. The more than 14,000 federal inmates housed at privately managed facilities represent a fraction of nearly 152,000 federal inmates currently incarcerated. It talks a little bit more. It goes to some details a little bit, but we're going to go to the Hill article and then directly to the source of the executive order and what was in the executive order from the White House and what they released. But we'll read this Hill article first. It states here, Biden directs DOJ to phase out of use of private prisons. President Biden on Tuesday ordered the Department of Justice to phase out its use of private prisons. The executive order, signed alongside 3 others as part of an effort to address racial inequality, largely returns to the Department of Policy adopted under the Obama administration. To decrease incarceration levels, we must reduce profit-based incentives to increase by phasing out the federal government reliance on privately operated criminal detention facilities. The order directs the DOJ not to review any of the contracts with private prisons that hold housing inmates, roughly 14,000 out of the 2 million people incarcerated in America. Criminal justice reform advocates say the move is an important first step in reducing reliance on private prisons, which critics argue have little accountability and these models are incompatible with efforts to rehabilitate offenders. But some warn the order will only have a limited impact, practically given the length of contracts that may have been signed under the Trump administration. That's just 9% of the Fed prison population, and many of those contracts are 10-year contracts, and some of them were recently signed, said Lauren Book Elzen, director of the Justice Program at Birmingham Center for Justice at New York University. And then it talks about the other order that we read about, the housing equipment, but we're not so interested in that as to the other one. Both are important, of course, but we're a little bit more interested in the justice reform part of the bill, hence the name of the stream. So this is directly from the White House itself over the executive order and the criminal detention policies. We'll read all of it because this is probably important to understand since it's directly from the source. Section 1 policy. More than 2 billion. More than 2 million people are currently incarcerated in the United States, including a disproportionate number of people of color. There is broad consensus that our current system of mass incarceration imposes significant costs and hardships. I lost my place. There's broad consensus that our current system of mass incarceration imposes significant costs and hardships on our society and communities and does not make us safer. To decrease incarceration levels, we must reduce profit-based incentives to increase by phasing out of the federal government reliance on privately operated criminal detention facilities. We must ensure that our nation's incarceration and correctional systems are prioritizing rehabilitation and redemption. Increased individuals should be given a fair chance to fully regenerate into their communities, including by participating in programming tailored to earning a good living, securing affordable housing, and participating in our democracy as our fellow citizens. However, privately operated criminal detention facilities consistently underperform federal facilities with respect to congressional services, programs, and resources. We should ensure that the time in prison provides individuals to the next chapter of their lives. The federal government also has responsibility to ensure the safe and humane transport of those in federal criminal justice systems. However, as the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General found in 2016, privately operated criminal detention facilities do not maintain the same levels of safety and security for people in the federal criminal justice system for the correctional staff. We have duty to provide these individuals with safe working and living conditions. And it talks about the criminal detention facilities just a little bit. But we're interested in that, but not as much as the first section of that bill. And once again, if you want to read that last little bit that talks a little bit about the detention facilities, you can find it on my YouTube at the Breakdown with Birkenhoff, or joining my Discord under the article news part of the Discord. But we're going to listen to our last video by somebody who's talking about some private prisons, and she was also a former ex-con, and we'll just listen to part of what she has to say about private prisons and their impact and everything relating to it, and her general thoughts about Biden's executive order.
Executive orders. Am I crooked? Hold on. Okay, executive orders are great for 4 years or whatever if a new person is brought in, if a new person is elected. So an executive order is only good for that president's term, okay? So Biden came in, signed 13 executive orders, and we're only talking about the prison one today or ever. So if the next president wants to come in and be like, we like for-profit prisons, he could just throw that out. So while this is a very important first step, this is just an executive order. What needs to happen now is legislation beyond the executive order. So in order to phase out private prisons, it has to be done gradually. It has to be done in a way that allows inmates to be safe. So, like I said in the beginning, if your president, the president you voted for, lost, wait 4 years. If you don't like this policy, wait 4 years. You know, there's so many checks and balances. And we're going to talk about what private prisons are, how they're run, and why they are so bad in a second. But I do just want to mention that I don't even know where I was going because I read the comments and I shouldn't have. There are so many things a president can and can't do, okay? So a president cannot make large sweeping motions to, phase out prisons across this country. They can only do things at the federal level. That is the power the president has. He cannot say, I want Iowa to do this in their state prisons, because we are the United States of America. So when I say that it's important to vote at the federal level and it's equally important to vote at the state level, I mean that. It is very important to research the bills that they're trying to pass, vote in your local people so that they can, start to make the progress for state prisons, which is the majority of inmates. Most people are serving time in jails, county jails, or state prisons. So while this is a really great first step, this is a fraction of what needs to happen. Okay, this is a speck, right? Because we're talking about less than 8%, 8% in total are in a private prison. 1% federally are in a federal private prison. So let's talk about why private prisons are bad in the first place. Private prisons are bad because their goal is to increase revenue. When all you care about is your bottom line, people are going to suffer. So private prisons provide less training for officers, which is extremely dangerous to the officers that work in that unit. And if you don't care about inmates, or you don't care about, their life inside of prison, at the very least, you need to care about the correctional officers working behind those walls. When you have less training for your officers, you put them in danger. Training costs money, okay? If you're just coming in, I'll read your comments at the end. Please let me get out what I'm trying to say. I appreciate you all for being in here and commenting. I want to get this all out so that people watching the playback.
So you can see here she's live streaming the thoughts, obviously from several. Anyway, she's live streaming some of her thoughts here about private prisons and whatnot, and I think she has very good points because she's mentioning training. A lot of times jobs, one of their biggest costs, especially corporate jobs, and you could say this is a similar position when you're talking about correctional officers and people who have to be running the prison, so to speak. That training is going to be one of the biggest factors the prison spends on, and the fact that private prisons are deciding to spend less on training costs and have undertrained officers is something that could put the correctional officers at risk themselves from prisoners who may become violent towards them, or even put the prisoners' lives at risk for various other reasons, and even cutting physical costs themselves, such as building costs for fire extinguishers or building costs for improper lighting or whatever it might necessarily be, could also be at risk to the inmates and even correctional officers themselves as well. So cutting costs when it comes to the prison system can be ultimately dangerous in the way of trying to do something like that.
Can digest this in a better way. I know live streams are, difficult to watch in the playback. So when we have less training for officers, it's extremely dangerous for them. They don't know how to handle situations that are thrown at them every single day. And what's really sad about that is I interviewed a correctional officer. Her name is Kim. I love her to death, but she was not provided any training when it comes to how to handle an inmate on inmate fight. She was only told how to block a punch, so she doesn't know how to handle, a lot of situations that go on, whether that is flooding a tier, a riot, inmates fighting or attacking you. And that is just a really important piece to prison. You know, we need to train our officers. We need to take care of our officers, pay them well, which is another issue with private prisons is correctional officers are not being paid adequately. You know, they need to be taken care of. They need training to combat inmate manipulation, physical violence, all kinds of things. So I think it's very important. You know, correctional officers are the backbone of facilities, and they need to be trained properly so that they can be safe and go home to their families. Okay, and private prisons do not do that because that costs money. Okay, private prisons also have like zero safety measures. Now, I've spoke to a lot of officers that work in private prisons where they don't have the fire spigot things. They only have a fire extinguisher at the officer desk. A fire extinguisher. Come on, you guys, we're talking about like basic safety precautions. If there is a fire, it's important to have a system in that prison so that the fire can be put out, right? I mean, it's very basic stuff that we're talking about. Another thing that private prisons don't do is they don't have much oversight when it comes to living.
I get ads from this Black Rifle Company all the time, but I'll just talk a little bit about here as well. As I was mentioning the whole fire spigot, she called it. I couldn't remember what their name was, but the things that are on top of the ceilings here or on the side or whatever it might necessarily be is one of the government regulations that federal prisons have to follow, and most state prisons, I would argue, probably also have to follow from state laws. But private prisons, from my understanding, and for what she was just saying here, don't necessarily have to follow those exact regulations. So that is also something that is rather interesting when we're talking about private prisons for safety of inmates and safety of correctional officers from a pure building perspective and not just a training perspective as well. But we'll continue on a little bit more and see what else she has to say. We have to let it catch up here. Come on. Sorry about that. It looks like the video is buffering a little bit here.
The right to not be sexually assaulted, verbally assaulted, physically assaulted, and clean living conditions is an inmate right. So when you have cockroaches and mice and mold and condemned places or condemned dorms that, you know, are just filled with asbestos and all this other things that I've seen in so many prisons across this country, that is against the law. And quite often when we're talking about prison reform, people want to scream about money, but they're unwilling to do anything else when it comes to prison reform. They're like, I don't want my tax dollars going to that. We don't care about safety measures, shouldn't have broken the law. But the states are breaking the laws every single day when they're not only exposing the inmates to these unthinkable living conditions, but the correctional officers have to work in these conditions as well. So again, if you don't care about the inmates, at the very least, you need to care about the correctional officers that go in there every single day and have to work in conditions with mice and cockroaches and asbestos and mold. That creates danger for every single person in there, whether that is an inmate, a correctional officer, a nurse, a doctor, a janitor, whatever, whoever is working in there, you know, it creates a danger to everyone. So limited safety measures, limited oversight, less training for officers, all of that goes on in private prisons because their sole objective is to improve their bottom line. And that is why ending private prisons is huge, okay? Is huge.
She talks a lot more about some qualifications or ideas we could use for helping the situation about private prisons, and we're going to continue that a little bit more. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything here. Okay, we're still good there. So we'll continue a little bit more and see what she has to say. But that's just one of the big things about private prisons. But I also want to go back to Biden's executive order that she's previously mentioned as well. And she called it a first step because it is an executive order. and let's say candidate B wins next election, presidential election, and now it's a Republican candidate, he or she very well could sign an executive order that reinstates private prisons or allows private prisons to exist again. So executive orders are very easy to overturn. So although Biden's executive order for this incident is a very good one for justice reform, and many people are giving credit to Biden for it, as they should be, it's still something that could easily be overturned if the opposite candidate wins in the next 4 years. So we need to start pushing more for state regulations and even maybe federal regulations on a more reform basis. In other words, we need to start pushing a lot more. We have a small victory, but we need to start going for pushing more reforms, more ideas, more concepts now that we have kind of our first foot towards the hall, or you have one step, but you need so many more steps to actually get a significant effort for reform when it comes to the justice system. So there was a victory. Yes, private prisons are bad. Yes, private prisons need to end. And there's so many examples as to why, but we still need to be careful and think about what to do and how to step forward and how to ultimately improve the situation.
But again, unfortunately, the federal government can only do so much. So while this is a very tiny group of people, we need to start making changes at our state level. You know, again, I don't care who you voted for. I don't care about politicians pass bills. I care what's happening right now, right today. You know, I believe in bipartisanship, working together, reading these bills, and working as a team to end private prisons, to help the mentally ill, to get treatment for drug addicts. Those are the things I care about. Everything else, whatever. And I think the number one thing that we need to do is work together. Work together. I am not a Republican. I am not a liberal. I'm a human being that wants to see our country do better. You know, there's a lot of
The idea of governments work there for anything is, I don't know. I just don't see it anymore. I think the United States political system especially has become so bipartisan and efforts that I don't really see anybody meeting in the middle anymore. It's ultimately we win everything or we lose everything. There's no ultimately meeting in the middle when it comes to parties. You see this by people simply voting party line and not ultimately looking at candidates or whatever else. So even something that people should see alike on issues such as probably criminal justice reform, as we've been talking about on stream for today, is still something I don't think is necessarily going to happen when you have to reach across both sides of the aisle. And that's something that's very unfortunate because I do think it would be something that's very good for America to have. I don't really want to live in a society in a society that we live in today of America, that we can never really meet in the middle and decide on things that are beneficial towards both parties. We ultimately is we win or we lose mentality, as I just mentioned. So it's just a sad thing, and I don't really see it happening. But the only way for it necessarily to happen is by people meeting in the middle and understanding that this is an issue that both sides need to realize and both sides need to at least strive to become better at.
Pros and there's a lot of cons, and we're doing some things right, but we're doing some things really wrong, and we're failing with our prison system. And if you guys have watched me for any length of time, you know how passionate I am about prison reform and how important this is. But this is a baby step in the right direction. You know, this is going to take years to phase out private prisons, which, you know, I'll wait. I'm willing to talk about this for the rest of my life, which I do know that I will be talking about. And yes, I'll get to comments. I see you guys. I am going to get to comments. So what we need to do is pass laws and legislations to prevent people from going to prison in the first place. Half of all incarcerated citizens are serving time on a nonviolent drug offense, meaning that they are drug addicts that need treatment. So, when we're talking about states that have made a difference, Oregon is top of the list. They have decriminalized all drugs, meaning there's not going to be a cocaine store. It just means if you're caught in small possession of a substance, an assessment will be done and you will get the option to go to treatment. That is being funded by cannabis sales in that state. So I think Oregon, I think that's a huge first step. Are there problems with that? Absolutely. Are there people going to fall in kind of a gray area? And are some people going to take advantage of new laws that are being passed? Yep, like everything else, okay? What we need to do is help the majority of people, those that want the help, those that need the help. And if help was offered to me in my active addiction,
I think that's her greatest point when she talks about this. It's ultimately when you talk about trying to pass a criminal justice reform bill or anything like that, you ultimately are wanting to do something that helps the majority of people. There's always going to be people that find a way to abuse the situation on any bill, any law, any concept out there. People are crafty and people always find a way to be lazy. And there's always people out there that do that. But there's also people out there that are just looking to get by and just looking to solve a problem. And that problem could be addiction, which he's talking about drugs here. So the idea of trying to do something like Oregon is doing, and I think a lot of states are paying attention to Oregon's efforts and what's happening with Oregon, and maybe California might be next, or Colorado might be next, a state that already has weed legalized, could do something to pass the same sort of bill as Oregon if statistics prove it to be the right decision. So we could be seeing that here in the future, as it just got passed in 2020, I believe. I believe it was 2020 and not... Yeah, it was 2020, this last election cycle with the bills that got passed there. So I thought we would kind of end it here because I don't really have too many other thoughts, because I am going to be doing a video on the drug wars of maybe not my next live stream, but at least next week sometime, and talking about the drug wars, because I think we can spend a whole topic just on that, a whole stream, couple hours, just talking about the drug wars and the impact they had, especially on the criminal justice system. If anybody's listening now, I'll give a couple minutes, and if you want to leave a comment or you have a question for me. I see you, Adrian Tube has just joined. Thank you very much. I don't know if you're still here or not, but I appreciate you joining the channel. Sorry it's at the end. But if you have a question, I'll gladly answer your question. And if you have any topic ideas for me or anything, you can leave that in the comments as well. If you like what you're hearing, definitely make sure to hit that follow button or subscribe on wherever you're listening. I would greatly appreciate that. It keeps me motivated to keep going, or whatever else you want to say from there. I'll give a few more minutes for people just in case if there's anybody listening now. I'll read a little bit of this article and check comments, and if there's not anything else, I'll go ahead and end it there. But I'm gladly willing to go a little bit longer in case you'll have any questions. And I do have a Discord, so you can join my Discord as well. That's a good place to contact me there. This is from the Annals of American Academic of Political and Social Science, and it's about the end of the era, understanding the contradictions of criminal justice reform. The abstract here. Recent drops in the U.S. rate of incarceration have triggered much discussion regarding the fate of mass incarceration. Some observers suggest that the political consequences in favor of getting tough on crime has been shared and replaced by new consequences that the prison population must be downsized. In this article, we explore the possibility that neither legislation nor public discourse around crime and punishment has shifted so dramatically, and that the cultural dynamics surrounding reform efforts may undermine the prospects of comprehensive sentencing reform. To assist these hypotheses, we analyzed trends in the criminal justice reform from 2000 to 2013, and the newspaper stories, editorials on criminal justice reform since 2008. We'll go down to our analysis here, a little bit down. Data, methods, we want to go down. We'll start here. on the database of relevant legislation was compiled, the coder identified legislative possessions that could foreseeably impact correctional populations in a fairly direct way. For example, legislation that prohibits registered sex offenders from obtaining licenses that allow them to own and operate ice cream trucks were not identified as having a direct or feasible impact on prison populations. Legislation that expands and imitates capacity to earn credits towards easy release was classified as such. The coding protocol did not require the coders predict the magnitude of the impact legislative provisions would have in prison populations. Instead, the results are used to enable a qualitative assessment of the nature and direction of criminal justice policy reforms adapted since 2000. So I just thought we would quickly read about that. And this is a very good article if you want some in-depth information of the kind of earlier years with the criminal justice reform system. I don't see any other comments on where I'm streaming to. I'll check YouTube just in case. Nope, don't see anything there. I do have this video also linked in my YouTube and Discord from Larry Lawton as well. So if you liked his previous video and you want a little bit more information about a particular instance and some reform ideas, you could check that out by its title here you see in front of you, or by clicking the video on my YouTube description, or joining my Discord server. All of those links should be there in my About channel section for where you're listening to it from. So I don't see anything from anybody, so I'll go ahead and leave today's stream. Thank you very much, SM Knight, Sea of Noise, Viable Clan member, and what was it? Adrian YouTube, I think I'm saying the name, but thank you all for joining, and those who commented, I highly appreciate you as well. And have a great day, everybody who's listening now or in the future. I greatly appreciate all of you guys, and hope you join me next time. I am going to be doing a stream on Saturday or Sunday about gerrymandering in Texas and other places, and just how much gerrymandering affects American politics. So if you like that type of podcast, that type of idea, you can definitely join me there. It's either going to be a Saturday or Sunday. I haven't quite decided on a date. If you want to know that, you can either join my Twitter or Discord, where I post when I'm about to go live. But thank you, everybody. I highly appreciate everybody, and